Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to Cal Poly LA Metro Lecture Series. Stephen Phillips, who I'll introduce in a minute, will introduce our guests for the evening. My name is Angela Anthony, and I am the marketing director for Helms Bakery District. Normally, we would attend in person at Helms. Stephen and I have been working together, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that now, and it's kind of a fun in-person event. For those of you who don't know anything about Helms Bakery, I want to welcome you this evening. And Helms is a historic landmark building. We built in 1931. So it is a big year. It's a 90th birthday of the building. The Marx family purchased it about 50 years ago, and they began a loving restoration, created this adaptive reuse to what you see today, which is furniture showrooms, specialty shops, restaurants, and then normally where we host this inside the design center is to the trade showrooms for architects and interior designers. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to welcome the students. I want to welcome Teddy and Fonna to this evening and to the Cal Poly series. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Phillips, who is our host for the evening. Thanks, Stephen.
Got to unmute myself. Thank you, Angela. Always such a pleasure to have this opportunities from the Helms Bakery District. We miss you all and look forward to being in person sometime soon. My name is Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly LA Metro program in architecture and urban design. We have been operating in Los Angeles as an off-campus program for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo for about 10 years now, running also this event series with our studio. You can see the students here, about 36 plus students here in our studios with about 5 faculty, and some of them are here today too. I see Teddy and Tina, and I don't know if Pavel's out there, but anyway, a terrific group of faculty and students here in Los Angeles. We have studios and we have history theory classes, and the students intern in offices for the entire time as well. So I don't want to take up too much time either. I just also want to thank, we have a wonderful group of sponsors who support our program. Of course, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo is who we are, and the Helms Bakery District has been a fantastic sponsor. Also HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, Arc Reprographics, the ALA offers us media support. Bull Tauf has been one of our long-term sponsors, Co-Architects, Theater DNA, and also AC Martin. So probably with that said, I'm super excited to have Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman here with us this evening. This is going to be a fantastic, very contemporary lecture. Teddy, as some of you may or may not know, is one of our, probably our most esteemed or one of our most esteemed Cal Poly grads. And so he's had a fantastic career. We're very excited to, and probably even a legend too, within my time at Cal Poly. Everyone speaks about him so well, and we finally have this opportunity to hear them speak about their work. So Teddy Cruz is a professor of the Public Culture and Urbanism and Department of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego. He is known internationally for his urban research of the Tijuana-San Diego border, advancing border neighborhoods as sites of cultural production from which to rethink urban policy, affordable housing, and public space. Fonna Forman, with a PhD from Chicago, is a professor of political theory and founding director of the Center of Global Justice at the University of California, San Diego, theorist of ethics and public culture. Her work focuses on human rights, climate justice, border ethics, and equitable urbanization. Together, Cruz and Forman are principals at Estudio Teddy Cruz and Fonna Forman, a research-based practice investigating issues of borders, informal urbanization, civic infrastructure, and public culture, with a special emphasis on Latin American cities, blurring conventional boundaries between theory and practice, and merging the fields of architecture and urbanism, political theory and urban policy, visual arts, and public culture. Cruz and Forman lead a variety of urban research agendas and civic public interventions in the San Diego-Tijuana border region and beyond, And from 2012 to 2013, they served as special advisors on civic and urban initiatives for the city of San Diego and led the development of the Civic Innovation Lab. Together, they lead the UCSD Community Stations, a platform for community-based research and teaching on poverty and social equity in the border region. Just want to end this with that, they have 2 forthcoming monographs, which you should go out and get when they're ready. Top down, bottom up, the research and practice of the studio, Teddy, Cruz, and Fonna, Forman, and the political equator. Unwalling citizenship. Sounds fantastic. Anyway, please join us at the Cal Poly LA Metro program in welcoming Teddy and Fonna for a lecture. We'll have a Q&A afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Angela. And thank you, Stephen, for this wonderful invitation. It's always exciting for us to be with architecture students because we don't have a School of Architecture at UC San Diego. So it's always a treat. We're excited to talk with you about our research-based practice embedded at the San Diego-Tijuana border. We really see this zone as a microcosm of all of the injustices and indignities experienced by vulnerable people across the globe. Political violence, climate disruption, accelerating migration, rising nationalism, border building everywhere, deepening inequality, and the steady decay of public thinking. We live and work a few miles away from the child detention centers that will forever stain this period of American history. San Diego Tijuana has become a lightning rod for American nativism. And although the news cameras are gone, tens of thousands of Central American migrants wait at the wall for asylum that never comes, reviled by the Mexican public as a nuisance, as an infestation, or else they sit in US detention centers as tools of deterrence, separated forcibly from their children and exposed to a raging pandemic. It's been particularly devastating to witness the emotional impact on children in recent years, and their fear and the inevitable psychic internalization of being socially and morally marginalized. Hopefully there's relief on the horizon, right? It remains to be seen. The prospect of more border porosity is bringing even more people north right now. With misinformation circulating on social media, conditions are intensifying every single day. And climate change will inevitably accelerate these flows in the years to come. A recent United Nations survey of arriving migrants at our southern border found that 72% of them come from the agricultural sector, and agricultural failure was a major factor in their decision to walk north. Global injustice is an intensely local experience in this part of the world. Now, against these local atrocities, border communities and activists on both sides of the wall continue to confront and productively circumvent unjust power. Some of this contestation is about sanctuary, right? And protecting people who are targeted by the state. Some of it is working through the courts and working through institutions like detention centers to advocate for people who are already ensnared in the net of political violence. Some of it takes the shape of bottom-up civic agency that exposes and counters unjust power, transgresses boundaries. But much of it arises informally through everyday collective practices of adaptation and resilience in conditions of scarcity and danger. Over the years, Teddy and I have accompanied some of this bottom-up emancipatory transgression, the kind of eruptions of democratic will in close partnership with agencies at the front lines. Now, in recent years, these struggles have also attracted artists and cultural producers from around the world to engage in acts of performative protest. We've been critical of this uptick in ephemeral cultural action that kind of dips in and out of the conflict. It tends to be kind of extractive in its methods, and the impacts on public consciousness sort of as fleeting as the Instagram posts that they generate. What happens the day after the happening? We've been advocating instead for a longer view of resistance, a more systemic approach to the drivers of injustice, and more strategic thinking about cultural, institutional, and spatial transformation in the border region. These commitments have culminated over the years in a project that we'd like to share with you tonight, the UCSD Community Stations. Basically, a network of public spaces that are located in vulnerable neighborhoods across the border on both sides, where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, as well as urban design build projects in the city. The community stations are really the kind of field-based social engagement arm of our research-based practice, which is based inside the university. So here we are with our team, with some of our community partners in Tijuana just before COVID-19 hit. We have several core commitments that comprise what we think of as a community stations model. We think it's highly replicable for universities everywhere. So I'm going to introduce these commitments. Teddy will then take you on a tour of the 4 community station sites, and then I'll come back and conclude with a few words about our programming at the sites and how they link our local border context with sites of conflict around the world. So to begin, we localize the global. We've always resisted the idea that global justice is something that happens far away, out there in the world somewhere. Living and working where we do, we don't need to send our students away to learn about territorial conflict, migration, poverty, and climate justice. We are, minutes away from an international border in crisis, and this enables an amazing proximity between campus and field, between theory and practice, what we think of as a critical proximity. Of course, going, local in a region like ours means recognizing ourselves, right, as a region, a site of interdependence, despite the wall and the ugly political rhetoric that's designed to divide us. We are a binational ecology of flows and circulation, and our future is intertwined. Air, water, waste, health, culture, money, hope, love, these things don't stop at walls. We build trust bridges, long-term partnerships between our university and border communities. We're not sometimes like flaky university programs that come and go, kind of diagnosing crises, extracting data, and then disappearing. We don't disappear. We're there for the long haul. We decolonize knowledge. We're keenly attuned to power dynamics when universities arrive in communities, and are critical of both extractive research methods and humanitarian problem-solving missions. We don't do applied research and we don't do charity. We're not a service learning program. Academic culture is filled with vertical assumptions that we know more, that we are trained to solve the world's problems if only they would listen to us, right? We're committed to horizontal practices of co-production, engaging communities as partners with knowledges and agency. Everybody contributes, everybody learns, and we do things together in the city that no one can do alone. Along these lines, universities really too often take for granted the resources that communities invest when they work with us. Time, space, social capital, labor, knowledges. As a matter of epistemic justice and labor equity, these contributions need to be validated and compensated. We curate two-way flows, kind of inside out and outside in, unsiloing our campus, inviting activists and community leaders to teach with us, and ultimately, thinking outside the box, literally, about what it means for a university to commit to diversity. Cultivating skills of cultural sensitivity, empathy, and awesome respect. These are skills that are best learned in situ. Today's challenges demand intersectionality. This is clear. But everything that we do on migration, on climate change, environment, health, labor, education, urbanization, it's all refracted through the lens of social transformation. This is important. Everything we do is cultural. For us, it's about changing hearts and minds, right? Tackling inequality by increasing public knowledge about the roots and springs of injustice and growing connected, civically engaged border communities capable of collective action, advocacy, and productive contestation. Ultimately, we've been committed to building a cross-border citizenship culture, a sense of belonging that is defined not by the nation state or the documents you carry in your pocket, but by the shared interests and aspirations among people who inhabit a violently and artificially disrupted civic space. Those who benefit from narratives of separation and mistrust prefer that we remain a fragmented public, that the idea of citizenship divides us, right, rather than unites us. We've been seeking to inspire more inclusive imaginaries of coexistence and cross-border citizenship in this contested territory. Our cultural aspirations are really Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal, and a 20th century lineage of Latin American civic experimentation and urban pedagogy. In contexts of dramatic violence and social fragmentation, cities like Porto Alegre, Brazil, Bogota, and Medellin, Colombia, sought to heal the wounds of history and mobilize a cohesive civic identity through participatory cultural action. The way Antanas Mockus in Bogota, for example, used street mimes, urban games, and theatrical public disruptions to transform urban norms from the bottom up. Or the way Medellin, Colombia, transformed urban remainders in forgotten zones into vibrant civic spaces that prioritized access and inclusion. Very much like Medellin's now famous Library Parks project, our community stations represent a model of urban co-development between public universities and community organizations to fight the creeping gentrification of border neighborhoods. Each station that we've built is designed, funded, constructed, programmed, and maintained collaboratively between the campus and the community. And finally, we really reject conventional strategies of urban beautification that turn our public spaces into sites of leisure and consumption. We question the agendas of the creative class and their pop-ups, which too often accelerate gentrification and appropriate arts and culture for private ends, really becoming an apology for the absence of more substantial public investment in the city. We believe public space must become civicized, to use James Tully's beautiful concept, a site of dialogue and contestation, and infused with resources and tools to increase public knowledge and community capacity for political and environmental action. So now a tour of the UCSD community stations and just a hint about what goes on in these spaces.
So for us, urban justice is a distributive concept requiring not only the redistribution of resources, but also the redistribution of knowledges. We designed this reciprocal knowledge infrastructure as both a collaborative education platform and a model of shared urban intervention. We claimed that the economic and programmatic power of our public university can be leveraged for communities to develop their own public spaces and social housing. As a distributed system of public spaces transgressing the wall, the community stations spatialize social justice, mobilizing cross-border citizenship culture through cultural action. With our community partners, we have co-developed 4 community stations, 2 in San Diego and 2 in Tijuana. So we'll take you into a field trip moving from north to south. The UCSD Earth Lab Community Station is a partnership with Groundwork San Diego, an environmental justice nonprofit Located in the low-income, primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood of Encanto, a community characterized by high unemployment, low educational attainment, food insecurity, and cyclical poverty. The station occupies a 4-acre vacant parcel owned by the San Diego Unified School District, who granted the parcel to our partnership to increase educational capacity for the 8 public schools within walking distance of the site. The goal was to promote circulations between traditional classroom-based learning and outdoor experiential learning. This access to municipal land gave us leverage to assemble a unique cross-sector collaboration between a major research university, a local school district, and a grassroots organization to co-develop public space, placing education at the center of community development. Before COVID-19 hit, 3,000 kids and their families circulated through the Earth Lab each year, and during the current transition, it continues to operate as an outdoor, socially distanced classroom. Recently, the school district committed capital monies towards a more refined physical resolution of the site for what has been so far a largely informal effort, while UCSD will invest in sustainable educational programming, research, and management in collaboration with Groundwork, who will steward community participation. Pedagogic zones of the site will be focused on habitat restoration through energy, water, food, community programs, all wrapped by indigenous Kumeyaay knowledges and environmental practices. Ultimately, the UCSD Earth Lab Community Station will perform as an open-air climate action park designed for environmental education and climate justice. The district has also committed a school bond funding for a new climate action design building to anchor the site and as a pilot also for a post-COVID porosity in classroom design. This building, we are actually working in collaboration with Ralph Roslin, who is teaching at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo right now. This station will break ground in 2022. Moving south, the UCSD Casa Community Station is a partnership with the nonprofit Casa Familiar, a 30-year-old community-based social service organization. It is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro, site of the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere. The community is 90% Latinx and has one of the highest unemployment rates, lowest median household income, and worst air quality in San Diego County. The heart of this community station is a beloved historic church that sat for decades in disrepair and which we were able to rescue through this project with our partners. During construction, the building had to be lifted for installing new foundations. During the times of so much political violence inflicted on this border community, the surreal image of the church levitating with Tijuana's informal settlements in the background inspired a sense of hope for the local residents. With the adaptive reuse of this historic building as catalyst, we designed the UCSD Casa Community Station as a double project. A parcel-size social infrastructure, which you see here, made of spaces for cultural and economic activity, is flanked by affordable housing. The organizational design of the parcel through a system of linear stripes with a variety of small-scale buildings performing different roles was also a deliberate strategy to mobilize diverse financial streams to fund the different building typologies. Leveraging programmatic investments by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to support the educational, cultural, and research programming between our university and the community, Casa Familiar and UCSD secured capital investments by the Park Foundation and Art Place America to build the social service infrastructure. These investments enable, in turn, Casa Familiar to qualify for a $9 million new market tax credits development package facilitated by the municipality. Casa Familiar has become, effectively, an alternative developer of affordable housing of its own, for its own community of San Isidro, and public space was the detonator. We renovated the historic church into a community theater with an outdoor stage. This performance space is flanked on one side by a series of small accessory buildings for Casa Familiar's social programming. And on the other side, by an open air civic classroom pavilion. This social, educational, and cultural infrastructure anchors 10 units of affordable housing at both ends of the parcel, all mediated by pedestrian walkways. We never imagined that this choreography of indoor and outdoor spaces would become a community asset during a global pandemic. Ultimately, the project advances a reproducible prototype for a small-scale development in low-income neighborhoods, where buildings collaborate to transform small lots into social housing infrastructures. We completed construction of this station in February, just before COVID-19 hit, and the residents moved in. It's all locked down now, but it's a site built for social proximity, and we cannot wait to return in person for programming. But what is important to say here is that affordable housing takes on a different meaning when it is deliberately threaded into spaces for social programming, summoning residents to participate in the development of local economy and cultural productivity, synergizing spaces, programs, resources, and people together. This is an integrated social spatial system that is programmed between our university and the community. Let's imagine a small coalition of local artists, promotoras, and neighborhood youth collaborating with our university curators, theater script writers, visual artists, students, who come together periodically to co-produce a play that explores an urgent issue facing the community, enacted by local youth in the community theater. These artistic productions are rooted in neighborhood stories and become bottom-up evidentiary material to increase not only public knowledge, but also to transform urban policy. Before moving across the border, allow me to pause for a moment to summarize a couple of concepts and share how these processes behind our two San Diego-based community stations exemplify several core commitments or building blocks, as we call them, in our practice. In conditions of poverty, housing needs to be embedded in an infrastructure of social, economic, and cultural support. In other words, we must rethink affordable housing from autonomous units and into relational systems, social systems. Housing for us is a public infrastructure. Density should not be measured as an abstract number of objects or people per area. Density must be understood instead as the intensity of social and economic exchanges per area. Migrant neighborhoods have taught us that these exchanges, mobilized by bottom-up urbanization, is the DNA for democratizing the city into a more inclusive and plural environments. Equally, zoning must stop being punitive, preventing socialization. Instead, it should be conceptualized as a generative tool that anticipates, stimulates, and organizes social and economic activity in neighborhoods. The developer's pro forma is architectural's financial plastic. Inside the mathematics of this spreadsheet, our services as architects amounts to 15% of a project's construction cost. This undercapitalized asset can be mobilized as collateral for development. Nothing should prevent us as architects from becoming developers of our own projects. And by association, nothing should prevent communities from doing the same. The sweat equity of architects, cultural producers and community leaders, the economic equity of public universities, and municipal protocols for accessing public parcels can be bundled, aggregated, to enable communities to develop their own neighborhoods. That's truly what has been our story. Moving now across the border, our two community stations in Tijuana are located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall. I will take a few moments to describe what is truly an incredible context. This location is at an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyon clashed with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, which is now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is hugely profound. As we zoom in further, we witness a collision between the estuary in the US, the border wall, and the informality of Laureles Canyon, which is home to 92,000 people. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. The site sits 30 minutes from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding, and landslides, and all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. Because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows upstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating this bioregional and shared binational asset. Here, the border wall is an artifact of environmental insecurity. These impacts have intensified in recent years because a profound lack of collaboration between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of the open lands of Laureles Canyons has been lost to irregular urban growth. We have been researching, identifying, and bundling unsquatted lands in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape what we are calling an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional cross-border project called the Cross-Border Commons, an environmental conservation initiative that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems shared between these two border cities. With our Tijuana-based activist partners, we are curating a coalition of state and municipal agencies, grassroots organizations, and universities on both sides of the wall. And we are now negotiating with the municipality in Tijuana to gain access to the remaining public lands inside this informal settlement. Another important contextual note before I introduce the Tijuana stations is that Laureles Canyon has also been the site where we have advanced our research on informal urbanization. As we have written about over many years, the informal settlements in Tijuana are built with the urban waste from San Diego, recycling architectural parts to construct habitation and infrastructure. We have learned a great deal from these incremental building practices as people construct their own shelter in layers over time. In a case study we documented before, a metal frame appeared from one day to another. In a couple of months, recycled materials began to thread the spaces, and in the next weeks, an informal house emerged. We have also taken note that multinational maquiladoras or factories surrounding these informal settlements typically benefit from easy access to cheap labor. Over the years, we have experimented with factory-made material systems to structurally mediate the recycling of waste. Because Tijuana is a city of multinational factories that prey on cheap labor, we have proposed an ethical loop where factories should invest in emergency housing. Here we are inside Mecalux, a Spanish maquiladora that produces lightweight metal shelving systems for global export, negotiating with them and adapting its prefabricated systems into structural scaffolds as armatures for informal housing. We designed a catalog with the factory's engineers to test a variety of prototypes and configurations. The first Mecalux typology is shown here with adapted recycled urban waste from San Diego, illustrating how top-down institutional resources can support the bottom-up creative intelligence of informal urbanization. A couple of years ago, we built the first example. Being inside the factory, redirecting its material systems and surplus value to sites of emergency was an important milestone in our research-based practice. We then worked with our partners to build early applications to demonstrate to the community the adaptability of the system, such as this small bus stop to shelter Laureles workers from the sun. It was important to introduce you briefly to these contextual processes because our two community stations in Tijuana operate within this rich ecology of social, environmental, economic, and material relationships and partnerships. Now to the stations themselves. The UCSD Alacran Community Station is located in the most rugged, precarious, and polluted sub-basin of the canyon. It is a partnership with Embajadores de Jesús, a religious organization led by activist pastor economist Gustavo Banda and pastor psychologist Zaida Guillen. With limited resources, they began construction of a refugee camp to provide shelter, food, and basic services to hundreds of Haitian and Central American refugees while they navigate unjust asylum processes in the US and Mexico. And with the help of skilled migrants, they began building their own emergency housing. We have established a long-term partnership to co-develop a community station here to increase refugee housing capacity. We have accelerated production of Mechalux frames to install them on vernacular post and beam concrete systems into a new housing infrastructure. The housing scaffolds will be built first, leaving the interiors as planned open systems equipped with utilities to support incremental live-work configurations. These envelopes are the seeds for an evolving sanctuary neighborhood to be infilled through time by the migrant residents themselves. We see migrant housing as a mechanism for generating jobs. To sustain the construction process, over time, we are designing a sanctuary economy. We embed refugee housing in spaces of fabrication, training, small-scale economic development. So with the support of the Park Foundation, we have assembled a community-owned business, the Little Haiti Construction Cooperative, with a tool library, wooden metal fabrication machines, and a couple of trucks and tractors. They will complete, our partners, the construction of the site and remain operational for future construction jobs across the canyon. The UCSD Alacran Community Station began construction last summer with seed capital provided by New York-based philanthropists Robert Rubin and Stefan Samuel, whose collaboration on this project expands their commitment to the prefabricated social housing logics of post-war French architect Jean Prouvé. And finally, our UCSD Divina Community Station. This station is a partnership with Colonos de Divina Providencia, a Tijuana NGO that is rooted in the community of Divina. The nonprofit facilitates a variety of social services, including meals for youth, senior services, medical assistance, and environmental awareness. Using the same factory-made Mechalux parts, the station takes the shape of a flexible scaffold to accommodate a variety of informal programs, including markets, cultural events, and a series of multi-level spaces to accommodate a small high school, all curated between our university and our partners. At the Divina Station, we work with community leaders, students, and researchers on social protection from landslides, floods, and estuary health beyond the wall. And we lead educational programming through which young people understand zones of vulnerability in their own neighborhood, emphasizing ecological conservation of species and habitat restoration. It's never too early to begin. We have committed to elevating children here as the cross-border citizens of the future. Our two community-based stations in Tijuana have also advanced important building blocks for our practice, two in particular. For us, the informal is not just an aesthetic category, but a praxis, a dynamic set of functional urban operations from below that counter and transgress the imposition of top-down political power and exclusionary economic models. And hospitality, we are rethinking hospitality, and we know that it is the first gesture when the immigrant arrives, an essential charitable opening, a first step in creating a more welcoming society. But as needs become more complex over time, charity is not the appropriate model for building an inclusive society. We need to move from hospitality to inclusion. Thinking beyond shelter is the foundation for rethinking refugee camps everywhere, from places of short-term habitation and service provision to durable infrastructures for inclusion. Migrant shelters can be agile for negotiating both transition and rootedness, the ephemeral and the permanent.
So these are our 4 UCSD community stations. There's so much more to say about them, about our amazing partners and what we do together in these spaces. While all the stations are focused on different issues, reflecting the priorities of each community, they're all richly curated for dialogue, collaborative research, urban pedagogy, participatory design build, and cultural production. They all aspire to increase public knowledge, challenge divisive political narratives, foster solidarity and collective agency, and advance strategies that counter exploitation, dispossession, deportation, and environmental calamity. These activities, often invite encounters with formal institutions of power that govern the border zone. Sometimes these meetings facilitate mutual recognition, and sometimes they don't. For us, the goal is less about resolving conflict than about understanding it, recognizing and democratizing it. We see democracy in the border zone as a fundamentally bottom-up process of exposing and rendering more accessible the complex histories and mechanisms of injustice that are really too often hidden beneath official accounts of who we are in this region. Racist political narratives in the United States portray the border as a site of rupture and criminality, but we're committed to generating different stories, counter narratives about life in this region, grounded in the experiences of the people who actually live here. We're a region of flows and circulation, of shared practices and aspirations, of alliances of hearts and minds, regardless of the wall that restricts the movement of our bodies. In this sense, the community stations become a kind of cross-border observatory, a platform for constructing what we think of as an elastic civic identity, right? From the bottom up, across border res publica. With our partners, we curate unwalling experiments, that dissolve the wall using visual tools like diagrams and radical cartographies to situate border neighborhoods within broader spatial ecologies of circulation and interdependence, from local to regional to continental and ultimately to global scales. We see elasticity as a kind of civic skill, right? The ability to stretch and return between local and more expansive ways of thinking over and again, to understand one's challenges within broader dynamics and processes, and to envision opportunities for solidarity and collective action across walls. Here at the border, the idea of a bioregion, right, that Teddy shared with you earlier, the binational watershed system, has been a really powerful imaginary for activating more elastic civic thinking. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that Homeland Security carved into the wall between Laureles Canyon and the estuary that Teddy introduced to you earlier. We negotiated a permit with US Homeland Security to transform the drain into an official port of entry for 24 hours, going southbound. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-presentation as just artists, as long as Mexican officials were waiting on the other side of the border to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, residents, representatives from the cities of San Diego, Tijuana, the municipalities, artists, border activists from around the world. We summoned agencies who are typically at odds with one another to come along with us. As we moved southbound under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater flowing northbound toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports amplified the most profound interdependencies of our region. The great insight here was that protecting the vulnerable US estuary demanded shared investment in the informal Mexican settlement. So in this cultural example, we went down, right? But sometimes nurturing civic elasticity requires ascending above the familiar. In the early 20th century, Patrick Geddes designed the Camera Obscura in the center of Edinburgh, a 5-story observation tower that enabled people to look out across the territory, right, across the region, and comprehend the environmental systems that comprise it. He coined the term regionalism, Geddes. For him, it was essential, right? This ability to, understand the territory was essential for constructing a civic identity and building a collective political will. Now, imagine a Mexican child on a narrow sliver of land standing above the Larelas Canyon, hundreds of feet above the border wall, right here at a place called Mirador. Imagine she plants her feet facing due west with the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean in front of her, Mexico to her left, the US to her right. Below to her immediate left, she sees the dense informal settlement where she lives. She can spot her house, her school, her experience, and experience their proximity to a country that she and her family are not allowed to enter. Below to her immediate right, almost directly beneath her feet, she sees the border wall, which from this vantage looks like a flimsy and ridiculous strip inserted into a vast and powerful natural system, right? Lifting her eyes, she sees the green expanse of the Tijuana River estuary with its vulnerable wetland habitats and sediment basins, you can see them there, that are contrived to catch the northbound flows of waste and sediment from her community. And further beyond still, you can't see it in this image, she can see downtown San Diego rising vertically into the sky. From this vantage, all the characters of this contested zone come to life. We've witnessed this moment of recognition again and again over the years, among children, among our students, among policymakers, foundation presidents. There are few places on earth, we argue, where the collision of informality, militarization, environmental vulnerability, and the proximity of wealth and poverty can be so vividly experienced. But the truth, in reality, the conflicts that we experience here locally between nation and nature, right, are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the United States and Mexico. Over the years, we've collected aerial photos like these that document precise moments where the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, powerfully illustrating what dumb sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus project stretches our elastic civic aspirations to the continental scale. Mexus visualizes the entire border zone without the line. It dissolves the border into a bioregion whose shape is defined by the 8 binational watershed systems bisected by the international border. Mexus also visualizes, exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory: tribal nations, protected lands, croplands, urban crossings, many informal ones, 15 million people, and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is in 2018 at the Venice Architecture Biennale. In Community Stations programming, Mexus has really become a provocation for dialogue about a shared bioregional civic identity among Mexicans, Americans, and diverse tribal nations who inhabit this contested space. Now, the final civic stretch, literally, is a visualization project called the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana across the planet, forming a kind of corridor of global conflict between the 30 and 38th parallels north. Along its trajectory lie some of the world's most contested and violent thresholds. US-Mexico, right here, at San Diego, Tijuana, the most trafficked international border in the Western Hemisphere, the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the main route from North Africa into Fortress Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, emblematized by Israel's 50-year military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, India, Kashmir, a site of intense and enduring territorial conflict between Pakistan and India since British partition, the border between North and South Korea, which represents decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Now, visualizing this red political equator alongside the climatic equator below here in green was an astonishing discovery for our practice, because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, and human displacement. I mean, it's amazing. And when these parallel equators are applied to the Pierce quincunxial projection, from above, the Arctic becomes protagonist, with its melting ice caps detonating hemispheric conflicts through sea level rise, dramatic coastal vulnerability, and human displacement. So really, in the end, the collision of nationalism and borders, right, climate catastrophe, and forced migration is the global justice trifecta of our time. But as we said at the beginning, these dynamics always hit the ground somewhere, right, and are experienced by people locally in everyday places like ours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm
Wow.
going to come back. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. That was fantastic. Kind of overwhelmed. Super fantastic work of a lifetime of serious focus and achievement. And also the way in which you constructed the presentation is equally as sophisticated as the work itself. So, I mean, we're very humbled to have you here, really bringing this very provocative, problematic, thoughtful, creative work. Really a lifetime achievement award is worthy. I do have a questions, and then we'll open to more questions, especially because of the last kind of commentary that you guys were just bringing forward about the construction of border conditions. And I was wondering how you might argue that these really troubled border conditions serve the political powers that set them up and continue to support them. They're not exactly accidental, as you clearly identified. They're strategic and they're disheartening.
Yeah, and one of the challenges that we face all the time is that communities that are living in conditions of poverty and deprivation, they tend to naturalize the conditions around them as if it's just the way of the world. And one of the most important strategies of visualizing the invisible and radical cartography is to help communities understand that people made decisions to put freeway infrastructure next to their children's school. People made decisions to put up a border wall and make it really hard to cross so that all the exhaust is in the air and you get lung disease, okay? These are man-made decisions that require man-made solutions. So it helps to build a political consciousness. And that's as important in our practice as building buildings and infrastructure. I mean, we really want to build consciousness and solidarity in a region that's so traumatically violated by political decisions.
A fundamental building block in our practice, as we discussed a few of them, but has been really foundationally the idea that urban conflict can be a creative tool, and that would require us as designers to retroactively really position ourselves within every urban border where top-down forces of urbanization and bottom-up ecological and social systems collide. What produced that collision in the first place? What are the conditions that produce the crisis? Those conditions become the material for the designer. So it's a counter power situation, because precisely those collisions were designed, as you are saying. I mean, the fact that the border itself as an artifact of fear and division, while it is physicalized at our own border, is really invisibly reproduced in many of our cities through the fragmentation of institutions, the alienation and marginalization of communities. So I think that as designers, we need to begin thinking that every urban intervention in the urban field has to begin by understanding the contested power relations that were in fact by design constructed the kind of, again, marginalization and crisis that we're witnessing.
Yeah, I'm still taken aback. It's really fantastic work, and very also the way you represent it and you visualize it and bring it forward. I also maybe just another quick question before I'm hoping the students, and I'm sure I see Tina joined us. I'm sure she has some questions as well. Couple things. Number one, how did you motivate or affect the UC system to support you in really helping to fund and help you to create these incredible, I mean, your housing project, the affordable housing one by the church was really a fantastic social project. And it seems that you're leveraging them in a really sophisticated way, which doesn't often happen at the university level. You must have convinced someone somewhere in a very strategic manner. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
We are persistent. Our projects are very scrappy and bottom up. They look very well packaged now as we're sort of relating the process to you from this perspective, 10, 15 years on. But we built trust and momentum very slowly and incrementally from the bottom up. And we happen to have a chancellor who has been really interested in sort of reconnecting this university with the city, and particularly with the binational region. The university for decades was very remote from what was actually going on in the city. And so, success breeds success. So as we started small and we were able to show the campus, hey, we can generate funding for this, and we can create these amazing opportunities for students to do field-based projects in a network of trust that we built. We built confidence on the campus, and now they're like, they've fully gotten behind us. But it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, universities are slow, conservative institutions with a small c, right? They don't take to change very well. But once they see opportunities, our university was agile enough to work with us to really advance these things.
And the issue is that, in the end, part of the story has been the question of expanding the design field. That really, in our case, we could also be designers of civic process and economic process, pedagogy, radical pedagogy to change hearts and minds, primarily at a time when the public has been hijacked by disinformation, etc. But one of the main places of intervention has been how to facilitate cross-sector collaboration and whether it is a factory in Tijuana to negotiate their redirecting of the surplus value or the material systems, so I think that we have intentionally really positioned ourselves to curate those types of communications across often divided sectors. But yes, it has required adjusting our own language in the kind of persuasion that Fonna was referring to. I mean, conversations we had with our chancellor when he actually was asking very openly and directly, why do you think we could intervene into social and economic development or urban? And obviously, education, we argued education could be a central actor or condition central to really providing to communities in need access to higher education. And that sort of level of accessibility and thinking that education through new forms of engagement could really, not maybe in the short term, but in the long term, begin to open up not only a new sensibility, a kind of sense of hope in communities, but really integrate them in forms of co-development. And so it was an interesting set of conversations, to tell you the truth. And this is inside the university where we are claiming, and you know it, I mean, we as professors are evaluated by categories that are as ridiculous as the siloing of our knowledges, right? It's like service, teaching, and research, at least in the UC system. And forever, our work has been divided in that sense when they evaluate us, because they think that what we're doing is service, when in reality, we've been claiming that this is really a form of research
And teaching.
and teaching. So it's blurring the boundaries. And so we're constantly trying to really redefine the language in a sense, and producing the evidence to do so. And so I think the chancellor got it in the end, that this could be a distributed university, but instead of the university planting its flag of colonizer, it could really enable the communities to lead the way. And so, and he gave a speech, by the way, at the opening ceremony, and we never forgot it, right, Fonna? Because the language that he used was almost like
beautiful.
You know, he called it inside. What did he call it? I forget, Fonna.
We used it tonight. Inside out, outside in.
Yeah.
Right? He loved the porosity that we're opening the campus up, and he loved it, making it we're a public university, right? Like you, we're a public university. We shouldn't lose sight of our public mission. We're actually, you know, we were instituted to improve life of our state and people in our communities. And so he's really receptive to that.
And by the way, that's just a university. We also had to engage the community in rethinking and redefining our languages. And because obviously communities are also mistrustful of universities and institutions. And so, yes, building trust has been an essential process. It's been a long term. We are very masochistic in this case, because we said at some point, we are not going to wait for the client. We will co-produce, construct, design even the client potentially, but also the constituencies, the modes of representation, and even the economics that might enable the project in an unorthodox way. So we are interested in claiming that that the city cannot be monopolized in its development by private developers only, that all of us could be participating. And I think that this became an incredible push for us when we discovered that the university could in fact put something on the table. So it changed the terms. It really made things happen. We had been struggling to make this project happening for a long, long time.
That's great. Do we have some questions from, I guess, the panelists here? These are students and faculty. Tina, I saw you on mute. Do you want to say something? Or you're like in a car driving?
I am, but I am so grateful to you, Teddy and Fonna, for sharing your thought-provoking, your inspirational work. I am so grateful, Stephen, that you helped to organize this. I have so many questions. I'm not sure if I heard you say it today, but I know that I've heard you say it in the past, that you've been inspired by, among others, Paulo Freire's work on critical pedagogy and, of course, pedagogy of the oppressed. And I'm curious to know more about how that has influenced your work. I have so many questions, but that's just one of them. And how that might inspire our students, who I consider, frankly, to be co-learners of mine. So I'm learning through them. So yeah.
That's a great question. And we mentioned him briefly. Let me just say just a little bit about who. So Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educational theorist, basically. And he worked with extremely marginalized communities. And he wanted to understand what a post-colonial education could look like. How do you inspire hope and a sense of opportunity in people that have been crushed by centuries of domination and oppression? right? And he said something that was very controversial. What he said was, people need to learn how to hope, right? And the reason why that's controversial is because if you talk to anthropologists and other kind of more ethnographically minded people at universities, they say you can't tell people what to want. Communities need to be self-determining. They need to decide for themselves, which is true, right? But what if their horizons have been limited by their experiences? And so Paulo Freire's whole agenda was to open up minds through all kinds of sort of performative education. He really believed in sort of performative theater as a tool of role playing. He had all sorts of amazing strategies. And I actually saw there was a question in the Q&A about where we get our inspiration for our pedagogical programming from. It's that tradition. It's this sort of lineage of Latin American thinking about changing hearts and minds from the bottom up that's been most inspirational to us. And it really, I mean, it says something about our practice as well. We're really committed. We have a very interdisciplinary team. So we have architects and designers, we have social scientists and environmental researchers, we have artists and curators. We have a very diverse team with educators who work together to design programs really modeled after this idea of a pedagogy for the oppressed, you know. But we always try to stay humble as well. Like we're not coming in with the answers. In fact, people discover their own answers. But you know, it's colonization and oppression has an amazing kind of darkening effect on the mind.
And Paulo Freire really anticipated what is so relevant today. I mean, the desire, or the more than desire, the urgency to decolonize knowledges. I mean, to silo knowledge, not siloing knowledge is another form of power in this case, or exclusionary power.
Yeah.
And so when we are thinking of producing a collaborative educational model between university and activists, we're trying to get to that possibility. And through Paulo Freire, again, is the issue of revitalizing language through local practices, right? That kids in marginalized neighborhoods couldn't be introduced to major works of literature that were so canonical from the theoretical and literary kind of worlds, but they could potentially be absorbed by connecting to their everyday practices and desires and imaginations. And so, but at the same time, to tell the truth, this also is a very contested space because in our work, meaning the exchange of knowledges, because in our work, we have tried to set ourselves apart from the typical community design agenda, let's say for a moment, where architects are afraid to sometimes propose imaginations when they come to communities that we should just listen, which we should definitely, but listen in such passive ways that we are so afraid, and then we just hear, and then we go to the office to design, and we come back with some kind of design. We have been interested in really the choreography and the curatorial process where these knowledges meet. In other words, at that very moment where we can put something on the table that can be provocative, pushes back, and the community pushes back at us. And the idea that this exchange is in the words of Chantal Mouffe, is agonistic, right? That it really exposes not only the dominance of certain paradigms and misunderstandings in that sense. In other words, communities often might not necessarily potentially know certain possibilities from the standpoint of architecture. But what we need to learn from communities is their everyday knowledges and practices, their performativity, their capacity for solidarity, the way they negotiate spaces and boundaries. I'm saying this because some of the early workshops in many of these processes, you know, we would come to communities where a lot of the process was hijacked by conventional and patronizing advocacy planning processes, where developers and municipal planners come to communities just to convince them that they will let the developers build as long as the building looks like Aztec pyramids. Everything is hijacked by the politics of style. And so instead we were saying, let's talk about other issues. Let's talk about how everyday life happens in the neighborhood, how there is an economy being produced here informally, people plugging resources into a garage, an illegal granny flat in the back of a house makes sense. It's what our activist friend called common sense urbanization, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm trying to say is that the knowledge that advances us here with our community partners is something that needs to be curated, it needs to be problematized, needs to be complicated. And that also has been a very important part of our process, very difficult one. But anyway, much to say about Paulo Freire, as you saw, Ernestina or Tina.
So let me just say something. If you think about this visually, so we've been talking about moving from a vertical understanding of the way the designer or the university, the researcher engages the community to a horizontal one, right? And that horizontal brings conflict, inevitably. There's going to be contestation in the way people see the world, the way they understand what it means to have progress in a neighborhood. What we don't want to do is reproduce verticality with the community on top and the researcher or designer on the bottom, right? And there's too much surrender sometimes. And even advocacy planning oftentimes looks like a surrender. Oh, we'll get the communities, after we've told them that their option is A and B, and both of them support developers, right? There are no other options on the table. So, yeah. And that's why trust is so important, by the way. Horizontal relationships only work, right, in design if there's trust built in, that you can survive the contestation, that you'll get through that bump and then you'll move on. And then you'll know the next time when there's a conflict or a bump, you'll get through that one too. Well, we've had rough patches with our partners. These are long-term, really complex projects. We found ourselves at odds sometimes, and we get through it and we keep going together. That's what trust does.
By the way, that has needed that we design tools.
Yeah.
And that we construct a new kind of political language, as we call it, with our partners. We never forget a workshop. I will not describe it in detail because there is no more to allow for more questions, but we had to produce a game that really opened up the question of density. And that game, the performance, this is very much, again, Paulo Freire style, let's say, or that knowledge is performed. So the performance of the game and the way people participated in moving pieces around to understand density on a block arrived to an incredible set of reflections by the community. That density potentially, this is, we share with you one of those today, that density shouldn't be an equation that measures things in relationship to area or people, but it should be an exchange, a social exchange, or that density could be about spaces and not necessarily objects. And that was unbelievable when when people that were participating in the workshop from the community began to demystify what density is, which density has been sold as the devil in Southern California. It began to open up a channel of communication that was so much very different from the idea that buildings should look like Aztec pyramids.
Tina, did you have another question, or do you want me to open it?
I do have another question. So it's about shared goals, shared strategies. And I was just curious if you could identify instances, let's say on either side of the US-Mexico boundary, where where you felt that there was a strategy that you learned from one of the others, from the other, let's say side. I'm not sure how to articulate it, but what have you learned in your practice about, again, how the shared goals are met by sharing these strategies in these diverse sites?
Well, at bottom, our practice, often we refer to as a double practice. And obviously here's where we become curators of that desire. I mean, in a sense, it's not to say that it will be immediately performed, let's say, from one side to another. That knowledge has to be carried and you know, and back and forth. And so in a way, the double practice means that we've learned a lot from informal settlements in Tijuana through processes, as we discussed today, of not only recycling the waste of San Diego into new narratives and new possibilities in terms of housing and infrastructure, the temporalities, the incrementality of layering spaces, the softness and layered affordability of informal urbanization, the negotiation with contours and so on. All of that we would have to translate and curate. And so often we think of our practice as a curatorial and translational practice. All of those procedures embedded in that informality, even though people don't see it, right? Because it's at first value is kind of maybe poverty or marginalization, even though there is a lot of obviously huge struggle and travel there. We've always tried to elevate the creative intelligence of those environments, translating their procedures. Now we can have the tools to intervene into the homogeneity and sameness of American suburbia, or suggest that the future of Southern California can be defined by the retrofitting of the large with small. In that sense, a more intensive programmatic agenda of social, economic, cultural sort of systems. So what I'm trying to say is that we carry that knowledge from one side. On the other direction, in a place that is already vibrant and chaotic and layered, we are intervening with a type of, at times, organizational logics, let's say, that could enable certain conditions to evolve in a more coherent and more visible way. So it's a you know, a double practice on each city. But anyway, that's us as mediators and curators of that information. There have been instances where we have been obviously working with activists that recognize the meaning and value of environmental cross-border systems that are being undermined by current policies. And so they, in a way, major part of our research is the question of the cross-border citizen. Identifying, we worked a lot with this in a variety of processes, identifying whether there is a sensibility cross-border beyond the wall, regardless of the wall, of a cross-border public that rallies again around those shared values. Often those are the kinds of flows that we've been interested, social, economic, but recently, as you saw through some of our diagrams, the environmental systems that are shared between these two cities, they need to be visualized because they inherently have been part of the language of our local activist partners. So, and there may be other examples, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Alina, did you have a question? I saw your hand was up.
Yes, thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Fonna and Teddy. It's truly inspirational, powerful, and informative. Follow up with Stephen's first question earlier. A lot of these political decisions were made intentionally, and there's a possibility that the government might not be fully supportive or of changing the existing condition. They might not just want to change the verticality. Was there any challenge you faced in the process of transforming the community from either the local municipality or the community?
In other words, did we ever find resistance to what we were trying to do from the top down?
Yes.
Oh, all the time. It's like it's more the norm than not. Let me say something about this though, about how, you know, about strategies of communicating to policymakers. You know, what we found working in this region is that you'll be able to find a segment of the population, right, who will engage these issues because they care about the well-being of other people. They're driven by public commitments. They're driven by ethical commitments to reach out to the neighbor and solve problems, right? And you can find a subsection of people within government who feel that way too, by the way. But most people make the decisions they do based on interest. And so our strategy with communicating with some policymakers and the business community, the private sector, is to tap into interests. Why does it benefit you to partner with people on the other side of this wall? And one thing that's been really useful to us is, the environmental challenges, the water challenges that are shared by these two cities. Once San Diegans, including policymakers, recognize that, waste flows from Tijuana are going to pollute their beaches, it's amazing how quickly their ears perk up. Wait a minute, our beaches. I mean, just like in LA, the beaches are like sacred. So nothing can hurt the beaches. But what it shows is that people are willing to open up and to listen when they understand mutual responsibility. Mutual interests. It can trigger a sense of mutual responsibility, and environmental challenges are really successful at doing that. We were very fortunate. Teddy mentioned that we work with this factory in Tijuana called Mecalux, and the CEO of that company was really receptive to providing subsidies for our emergency housing projects in Tijuana, because he was genuinely motivated by an ethical sensibility. It's rare to find people like this, particularly in the private sector. I mean, when you see corporations getting involved in public interest projects, you'll immediately see it put up on their website as their sort of humanitarian kind of face to the world. Look, we do good things. We use our profits to throw some benefits out there. But this guy was really genuinely motivated by a public sensibility. So we're not going to let go of this guy. He's willing to continue working with us, and he's just fabulous. But we communicate with policymakers through the lens of interest. If you want to talk about resilience, climate resilience in this region, if you want to talk about sea level rise and everything, we need to be working as a binational region. These problems don't stop at the border wall,
And that begins with the common sense. I mean, again, we need a return to a certain level of pragmatism, that the true understanding that in this environment of the border, these two cities' destinies is intertwined.
Yeah.
And when you begin to find the evidence, right, that the border wall can be a self-inflicted wound to our own resources. And when you begin to maybe make that into a public communicational framework to really rethink urban pedagogy, because that's what we need right now. I mean, it's just crazy, right? That we have been voting against our own interests.
Yeah.
So how easily our consciousness can be hijacked. And that's the reason I think that for us it's been education at the center of this, and also obviously oriented to children. But yes, it's trying to unlock, right, these sort of opaque narratives that at the end of the day, if understood, it would be a clear, I mean, it's what recently I keep mentioning this book, which I actually have to read, but it's called The Sum of Us, which argues for what she called the dividends of solidarity. That if we perpetuate this hateful agenda, we're just damaging ourselves, not only obviously ethically and morally, but primarily economically.
I think Montserrat, I don't know if I said your name correctly, you had a question that builds off of that.
Yeah, no, I was really, first of all, amazing talk. Thank you so much for your time. But I was really interested in the way you all designed systems of outreach, I think. And my question was how do you build trust with the community while navigating that pushback that you mentioned regarding project and design decisions, and all the while like differentiating yourselves from performative or predatory developers and nonprofits?
Well, on trust building, 2 words: show up. Don't disappear, show up. Not just when it comes time to like design a building, right? Show up during COVID, right? So we've been remote from our partners now for a year. It's like breaking our hearts, and our community partners are struggling really bad. So we did everything we could to try to mobilize support and food, and we installed a computer lab in our Tijuana station so that we could communicate with the kids and they could get some kind of educational access. I mean, we're doing the best we can. It's very, very difficult, but show up. You build trust by building trust. I mean, it takes time, right? It doesn't just happen overnight, which, by the way, is why we've been very critical of universities that just sort of send these programs into, underserved communities for a semester and then disappear. So that's the first thing. And on this issue of, differentiating ourselves from developers, I mean, obviously that comes out of trust, but, developers are driven by their bottom line. They're driven by profit. And Teddy and I committed a long time ago in our practice that we would only do public interest work. And we find ourselves in conflict with private interests all the time. And most depressing, just one more thing, most depressing for us is when we see public institutions like municipalities hijacked by private interests. Plato said 2,500 years ago, the sign of corruption, right, in a city or in a country is when the money makers rule. And if the rulers are hijacked by the money makers, they prey on communities like the ones that we work in. So we've committed ourselves to public goods and public interest, and through time, I think we've convinced our partners that we're on their side in these things.
Yeah, so the transference of knowledge, which I think, even though we were rushing through so many concepts in the presentation, but the idea that we can steal the knowledge of the developer, that nothing should prevent us, from almost reorganizing that spreadsheet, amplifying the hidden value of these everyday practices in neighborhoods, the programmatic capacity of nonprofits, which have by themselves also have access to very affordable pieces of land, the negotiation with municipalities to reorganize maybe community land trusts, the sweat equity of our own labor as architects, as I mentioned, is 15% of the construction cost, which is already a huge amount of money when put on the table as a leverage. In the universities, again, this is about transferring and democratizing the tools of development. And so, as one of our partners in the activists in San Isidro, Casa Familiar, once said, which surprised me, she said, gentrification is not bad, she said, if it is understood as a way of improving a neighborhood. But it is bad when it actually, that improvement displaces people. So part of our agenda has been how to think of communities as developers of their own housing infrastructure and public space, but also the modes of productivity. And so that's a huge leap in a way, but it is feasible. And in that sense, that's when you prevent gentrification, where you as architects become developers in collaboration with communities, where the residents are co-owners. We have been experimenting with ideas of community. Like today in the New York Times, there was a huge article about challenging conventional methods for affordable housing. That right now, when everybody, there's a lot of housing stock out there being sold by developers because of the condition at this moment, that this is the moment to form a social housing agency at the federal scale to buy all these projects and to begin to really reset the terms. In other words, I think that more and more the idea that residents can be co-developers, that we could reenact and recuperate hidden legislation about community trust, cooperatives that were maybe so successful before, but now need to be layered and improved at this moment. This is what we've been trying to experiment also with our community partners, to rethink ownership. That will be another one of our building blocks. We have been perpetuated a kind of sacrosanct, how to call it, paradigm of private property. But in our minds, the American dream has collapsed in the context of home ownership. And now when many of us cannot even pay rent, we have to rethink ownership and return to a more, ideally, more collective sense of collaboration at the scale of neighborhoods to rethink housing. So but yes, to challenge the terms that have produced gentrification is essential, obviously, here.
We're coming right to the end, but Tibby said something really wonderful in the Q&A, and I think it's a really great way to kind of wrap up. She, I don't know if Tibby's.
Tibby is built up. Tibby, do you want Tibby to ask the question?
Where is
I can
Tibby?
pull it. Tibby. Oops. Did I get it?
Hello?
Hi.
Hey, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, again, to ditto on being absolutely blown away and amazed by your work. I just, it wasn't so much a question, it just was, I think we need more of this kind of porous practice with the homeless communities everywhere in this country. And, you know, the images that I saw, I've never been to Tijuana, but right outside my door here in LA, my neighborhood, you know, are communities that, I mean, and more now than ever, that are just literally a block away from where I live. And then they'll disappear and you know what's happened. They've just been sort of bulldozed over and asked, you know, but nothing's really solved. And so I just think the way what you guys have been doing is, this is just has to be the way that that we deal with these lost people, these people that have been faced with this other kind of dehumanization and colonization, and you know, these people don't see any hope, and it's not, there's the top down does not work. If these people don't, they resist it, right? This is not the answer. They want to develop their own community. They want agency. And some of them mentally can't even manage that. So there has to be a way of incorporating the ones that can, and maybe they can take care of the ones that can't. And maybe we create this sort of circulatory system, right? Where it's within their own community that they help each other and then come and rise above. And you know, we all see the beneficial interest in it, in the way that you described how, you know, we hate to see our beaches messed up, but, you know, this is just, I think, has such potential in so many different areas. And the one person I was wondering if you had access to on your team, as you mentioned, artists and curators, was a filmmaker, because I think this would be the most amazing documentary. And I feel like more people have to know that this is going on, that's this amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you. I mean, that's just wonderful. And you know, people who are marginalized from the, you know, conventional private, you know, success model are not finding their way. We have to rethink our public commitments. And that's why, you know, architects alone are not going to solve this problem. Architects are part of the solution, working together with all kinds of people who can help tackle this issue. But I just thought that was a wonderful kind of way to punctuate this, because this is one of the main, like your generation, the students who are here, your generation needs to deal with climate change. It needs to deal with dramatic urban inequality like we've never seen on this planet, because there's so much migration. People are pouring into cities that can't handle it, right? Dramatic urban inequality and climate change are really the challenges of your generation, people who are interested in public interest design.
And yes, everyone, I unfortunately, we have to teach right now at 5:30. Our students are waiting, but I just wanted to say one last thing about this, because it's important. One of our building blocks is to really engage a new public imagination, as we call it. I mean, we ask of ourselves, where is our public imagination, our collective imagination, after so many decades of the dominance of neoliberal policy and economy, producing so much havoc through deregulation, right, through marginalization, exclusionary forms of development. So to recuperate a little bit of a trust at this moment on institutions. Yes, we've been disaffected by the top down in the way that it has inflicted so much havoc, so much fragmentation and so on. But what saddens us sometimes, sometimes in our students, there is so much disaffection about the role of government. I think that we have been working with the bottom up, with very grounded sort of practices that are embedded, but we feel that we are trying to translate the knowledge, the energies of the bottom up, only to knock on the doors of the institutions to rethink their policies. I think we need to continue thinking and betting for collaborative, inclusive, transparent, and just forms of governance, because levels not only of planetary coordination in moments of a global pandemic needs to happen, but really at the local, federal, state, neighborhood scales as well. So I think that Fonna mentioned climate and all of this. When I often hear people talking about the Green New Deal, I think many architects already just dream of the green, how they're going to camouflage their buildings with green skins that perform in particular ways, but nobody's talking about the New Deal part of the equation. I think that without a robust public and hopefully renewed public institution, it's very difficult to get us to advance the needle. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So I think that we really truly believe in institutions, and that we as architects can be the designers of new institutions. And when they are absent, we cannot leave them off the hook, and we need to somehow facilitate and advocate. So we have to demand accountability, and that begins with our own practices. So thank you for inviting us today, and we'll continue hopefully the conversation, Stephen and the students, if another time, so that we can get to our class.
Yes, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you. And I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
well, you've got to go teach. So thank you,
much.
thank you, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Really.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Bye-bye.